They looked like the perfect American family. Wealthy, respected, untouchable. But inside that mansion, anger and fear were quietly destroying everything. And before anyone realized how dangerous things had become, a horrifying act of violence would leave one man dead and a child traumatized forever. An 11-year-old child stood at the center of a murder investigation that shocked Palm Beach. Kevin Cooney had witnessed something no child should ever see. And when he finally took the stand, his testimony would decide whether his mother walked free or spent the rest of her life behind bars. For 2 decades, the Cooney murder case haunted everyone connected to it. Then suddenly, history repeated itself. Another shooting, another family tragedy. And this time, detectives uncovered a disturbing truth that made the entire case even darker than anyone imagined. What began as a glamorous Palm Beach love story eventually became a nightmare filled with fear, betrayal, violence, and emotional scars that lasted decades. This is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of a family destroyed from the inside. From the outside, the Cooney family looked untouchable. Wealth, power, luxury. Everything appeared perfect behind the gates of their Palm Beach mansion. But hidden beneath the polished smiles was a marriage slowly collapsing under secrets, resentment, and emotional warfare that nobody outside the home could see coming. Palm Beach was a world built on status and appearances. Linda Cooney entered that world determined to become someone important. To the wealthy elite, she was ambitious and beautiful. But beneath the elegance, people whispered that Linda wanted more than love. She wanted power, control, and a permanent place among the rich. Jim Cooney was respected throughout Palm Beach. Successful, charismatic, and deeply connected, he seemed to have built the ideal life. But behind closed office doors and expensive tailored suits, friends noticed growing exhaustion. Something inside his marriage was slowly draining him emotionally, and the tension was becoming impossible to hide. Dinner inside the mansion often felt painfully silent. The children sensed the hostility long before they understood it. Arguments started quietly, then exploded without warning. What once looked like a dream family had become emotionally fractured, leaving fear and confusion hanging in every room of the house. Late at night, Linda wandered through the mansion, unable to escape her thoughts. The luxury around her no longer brought comfort. Anger, jealousy, and emotional instability were beginning to consume her. And somewhere deep inside that darkness, something dangerous was quietly taking shape. Palm Beach glittered with wealth and perfection. But behind those glowing mansion windows were hidden affairs, emotional abuse, betrayal, and violence. The Cooney home was about to become the center of one of the most shocking murder cases the wealthy Florida community had ever witnessed. Kevin Cooney was only a child, but he already understood fear. Night after night, he listened to screaming echo through the hallways. The people meant to protect him were destroying each other right in front of him. And soon, Kevin would witness something no child should ever see. The arguments became more violent as the marriage collapsed. Friends later described emotional manipulation, jealousy, and uncontrollable rage. Inside the mansion, the tension felt unbearable. Every confrontation seemed to push the family closer toward disaster. But nobody realized how deadly things were truly becoming. Kevin learned to hide whenever the fighting started. He would sit quietly behind doors, praying for silence. Children trapped inside toxic homes often become invisible witnesses to trauma. And on one horrifying night, Kevin would be forced to witness the moment his entire world shattered forever. Neighbors saw police cars arriving more frequently outside the Cooney mansion. Flashing lights illuminated the wealthy neighborhood, while rumors spread quickly through Palm Beach society. But despite the warnings and emotional chaos inside the home, nobody imagined the violence would end in murder. Emergency dispatchers could hear panic and terror in the voices calling from the mansion. Every argument seemed more dangerous than the last. Yet even with growing fear and instability, the situation inside the home continued spiraling out of control toward an irreversible breaking point. At some point that night, Linda picked up a revolver. Whether driven by fear, rage, or desperation, investigators would later spend years trying to understand exactly what happened in those final moments. But once the gun entered the story, the tragedy became unavoidable. Crime scene investigators moved carefully through the mansion collecting shell casings, blood evidence, and shattered memories. The luxurious home now looked like a nightmare frozen in time. Every hallway, every room carried the emotional weight of a family destroyed by violence. By sunrise, the story had exploded across Palm Beach. Media vans crowded outside the mansion while reporters searched desperately for answers. Behind the police tape stood a devastated family, and inside the house lay the truth about a marriage that had ended in bloodshed. Moments after the gunfire, silence filled the mansion. Smoke lingered in the air while family members struggled to understand what had just happened. The scene was chaotic, emotional, and horrifying. In only seconds, one of Palm Beach's most respected families had been permanently destroyed. Investigators focused immediately on the .357 Magnum revolver lying on the marble floor. It was powerful, deadly, and impossible to ignore. Ballistics experts would later determine exactly how many shots were fired, but emotionally, the damage to the family could never truly be measured. Detectives carefully examined blood patterns and bullet trajectories inside the mansion. Every detail mattered. Was this self-defense, as Linda claimed? Or was it deliberate murder? The answers hidden within the crime scene would eventually decide the fate of a mother accused of killing her husband. Inside the interrogation room, Linda appeared emotionally exhausted but strangely controlled. Detectives pressed her repeatedly for answers about the shooting. Her version of events painted herself as terrified and abused. But investigators struggled to determine whether they were hearing the truth or manipulation. Outside the courthouse, the case became a media obsession. Wealth, family drama, and murder created the perfect storm for public fascination. Everyone wanted answers. But inside the courtroom, the emotional focus remained on two terrified children whose lives had changed forever overnight. Young Kevin walked into the courtroom, carrying unimaginable emotional pressure. Prosecutors knew the child had witnessed critical moments from the shooting. Whatever Kevin said on the stand could determine whether his mother spent the rest of her life in prison or walked free. The courtroom felt emotionally suffocating as jurors listened carefully to testimony about the deadly night. Every word carried enormous weight. Family members cried quietly while reporters documented every moment. And at the center of everything sat a frightened boy preparing to speak. At only 11 years old, Kevin became the most important witness in the entire case. His voice trembled as he described the terrifying night his father died. Jurors watched carefully, knowing the emotional testimony of this frightened child could completely change the outcome of the trial. As Kevin spoke, the courtroom became silent. Some jurors appeared emotional, while others looked shocked. His testimony painted a complicated picture of fear, violence, and confusion inside the home. And slowly, prosecutors realized the case they thought was simple was becoming far more difficult. Linda watched her son testify with tears in her eyes. For her defense team, Kevin's testimony was everything. If jurors believed the frightened child, Linda could avoid a murder conviction. The emotional bond between mother and son suddenly became the center of the entire trial. Newspapers across Florida exploded with dramatic headlines about the Cooney murder case. Wealthy Palm Beach families followed every courtroom update obsessively. The public could not look away from the disturbing story of a glamorous marriage that had ended in gunfire and death. After leaving the witness stand, Kevin sat alone, emotionally overwhelmed by everything he had relived. In one moment, childhood innocence had disappeared forever. The trauma of witnessing violence inside his own home would continue haunting him long after the trial finally ended. Television broadcasts replayed emotional courtroom moments night after night. Millions watched as the shocking murder case unfolded publicly. But away from cameras and headlines, a broken family was struggling privately with fear, grief, and emotional scars that would never fully heal. When the verdict was announced, reactions outside the courthouse were explosive. Linda Cooney had been cleared. Some believed justice had been served. Others believed the killer had escaped punishment. But nobody realized the story was far from over, and even darker tragedy still waited ahead. Nearly 20 years after the Palm Beach murder trial, Kevin Cooney was no longer the frightened child the world remembered. Friends described him as emotionally unstable, isolated, and deeply haunted by his past. The trauma that began inside that mansion had followed him quietly into adulthood. That on a quiet Las Vegas morning, Linda Cooney called 911 in a panic. Her voice sounded frantic and confused as she begged for help. But investigators immediately noticed something strange. Linda never clearly explained who pulled the trigger or how her son ended up bleeding on the floor. Police officers entered the home expecting chaos, but what they found felt far darker. Weapons, ammunition, and blood covered the scene. Detectives sensed immediately that something about Linda's story did not fully add up, and the atmosphere inside the house felt emotionally disturbing. Kevin lay critically injured on the floor, suffering from a gunshot wound to the neck. Investigators struggled to understand whether the shooting was accidental, self-inflicted, or intentional. The horrifying scene forced detectives to revisit a terrifying possibility. Had history repeated itself inside another family home? Then investigators made a shocking discovery. The revolver used in Kevin's shooting carried the exact same serial number as the weapon Linda once used to kill Jim Cooney. Detectives stared at the evidence in disbelief. After 2 decades, the same gun had returned to another horrifying crime scene. Crime scene investigators documented every shell casing, every blood stain, and every possible clue. The emotional weight inside the home felt overwhelming. Detectives knew this case was becoming much larger than a single shooting. It was reopening a dark family history nobody thought would return. As dawn rose over the quiet Las Vegas neighborhood, police tape surrounded the house while neighbors watched in shock. Behind those walls was a disturbing scene connected to one of Palm Beach's most infamous murder trials. And once again, Linda Cooney stood at the center of it all. Detectives spent hours comparing Linda's statements against the physical evidence. The more they investigated, the more inconsistencies appeared. Small details began raising serious questions about what really happened inside the house that morning, and whether someone was hiding the truth behind emotional confusion and fear. During interrogation, Linda appeared strangely detached at times, almost emotionally disconnected from the violence investigators were describing. Detectives watched her carefully, searching for cracks in her story. Every pause, every hesitation, every emotional reaction suddenly carried enormous significance. Inside the detective bureau, investigators covered walls with photographs, timelines, and evidence from both shootings. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore. Slowly, the investigation transformed from a single violent incident into a haunting psychological portrait of one deeply damaged family. Ballistics experts examined the revolver carefully, matching evidence from both crime scenes decades apart. Detectives realized they were looking at a weapon connected to 2 generations of tragedy. The same gun that ended Jim Cooney's life had now nearly taken Kevin's life as well. Late into the night, detectives replayed surveillance footage and emergency recordings searching for answers. Exhaustion filled the room, but nobody could stop thinking about the disturbing pattern emerging from the evidence. Something deeply unsettling connected the past to the terrifying present. Investigators reconstructed the shooting scene step by step inside the dark Las Vegas home. They measured blood patterns, bullet paths, and positions carefully. Every detail mattered because somewhere hidden inside the house was the truth about whether Kevin had been the victim of an accident or something far worse. Standing alone outside the crime scene, detectives reflected on how emotionally heavy the investigation had become. Cases involving families often leave deeper scars, and this one carried decades of unresolved trauma, violence, manipulation, and psychological damage stretching back to the Palm Beach murder years earlier. As investigators reopened old Palm Beach files, disturbing memories resurfaced. Yellowed photographs, courtroom records, and forensic reports revealed a family consumed by years of violence and emotional instability. What once seemed like a closed chapter was suddenly becoming terrifyingly relevant again. The similarities between the two shootings were haunting. Same family, same weapon, same emotional chaos. Detectives could not ignore how history appeared to be repeating itself in almost identical ways. The connection between the crimes transformed the investigation into something emotionally chilling. Ballistics reports confirmed what detectives already feared. The revolver connected both violent incidents with undeniable forensic certainty. For prosecutors, the evidence was emotionally powerful. For the family, it reopened decades of trauma they had desperately tried to bury and forget forever. Photographs of young Kevin during the original murder trial felt heartbreaking to investigators. The frightened child who once testified to save his mother had grown into a deeply troubled adult. Many wondered whether the emotional trauma of witnessing violence had slowly destroyed his life from the inside. Crime experts interviewed during the investigation describe how childhood trauma and exposure to violence can permanently damage emotional development. In many ways, Kevin's entire adulthood seemed shaped by the horrifying events he witnessed as a boy inside the Palm Beach mansion. The revolver became more than evidence. It became a symbol of generational trauma. Detectives stared at the engraved serial numbers, realizing the weapon had survived decades, while leaving emotional destruction behind everywhere it appeared. Its history now felt almost disturbingly cursed. Rain fell outside the police station while detectives continued reviewing decades-old testimony late into the night. The deeper they looked into the Cooney family history, the darker the story became. And emotionally, nobody involved could escape the feeling that this tragedy might have been preventable. Friends described Kevin as emotionally fragile for much of his adult life. Beneath his quiet personality lived years of unresolved fear, trauma, and psychological pain. The violence he witnessed as a child had followed him everywhere, slowly shaping the person he eventually became. Family photographs told the story of happier times that no longer existed. Smiling faces captured moments before violence destroyed everything. To investigators, the pictures felt heartbreaking because they revealed how quickly love, trust, and safety inside a family can disappear forever. Linda often appeared emotionally isolated, even surrounded by people. Investigators struggled to understand whether she was a grieving mother, a traumatized survivor, or someone hiding dangerous truths. The emotional complexity surrounding her behavior only deepened the mystery surrounding the shooting. Mental health experts explained how children raised around violence frequently carry emotional scars into adulthood. Fear becomes normal. Trust becomes difficult. And unresolved trauma can quietly damage relationships, self-worth, and emotional stability for decades after the original events occur. Kevin's childhood bedroom became a painful reminder of innocence lost too early. Old toys, photographs, and personal belongings sat untouched while investigators reflected on the devastating reality that the emotional wounds from childhood had never truly healed. The empty hallway symbolized emotional isolation inside the Cooney family. For years, pain, fear, and resentment silently echoed through those spaces. Long before the shootings, the family had already begun emotionally falling apart behind closed doors where nobody else could see the damage. Close friends later described exhaustion and sadness constantly visible in Kevin's eyes. The emotional burden he carried seemed impossible to escape. And investigators increasingly believe the violence that shaped his childhood may have ultimately shaped the tragic outcome of his adult life as well. As legal discussions reopened painful questions surrounding the family's history, the courtroom once again became filled with emotional tension. Lawyers debated evidence, trauma, and responsibility, while old wounds resurfaced publicly for everyone connected to the case. Investigators reviewed archived courtroom footage, searching for details overlooked decades earlier. Watching young Kevin testify again felt emotionally devastating. His frightened voice still echoed through the recordings, reminding everyone how deeply violence had shaped the family's future. Witnesses who once knew the family emotionally struggled while describing the years of dysfunction and fear hidden behind wealth and social status. Many admitted they had sensed danger long before the violence exploded, but never imagined the story would end this tragically. Evidence displayed inside the courtroom painted a disturbing timeline of manipulation, violence, trauma, and emotional instability stretching across decades. Prosecutors argued the family's dark history could no longer be ignored because the patterns were simply too devastatingly similar. News coverage reignited public fascination with the infamous Palm Beach family. For many viewers, the story felt almost unbelievable. A wealthy socialite tied to two horrifying shootings involving the exact same weapon separated by nearly 20 years. Detectives leaving the courthouse carried visible emotional exhaustion. Cases involving families often stay with investigators long after trials end. And this story, filled with fear, betrayal, trauma, and unanswered emotional questions, haunted nearly everyone involved in the investigation. Today, the empty mansion stands as a haunting reminder of everything that happened behind its walls. What once looked like a perfect, wealthy family became a nightmare filled with violence and emotional destruction. And even decades later, the shadows of that tragedy still remain.